At exactly 8 a.m., someone knocked like they owned my door. Not a polite knock, not a neighbor's tap, not the kind of sound that waits for permission. This knock was firm, measured, certain, the kind that assumes you'll open before you even decide to. That hour had always belonged to me. For 30 years, 8 a.m. meant quiet, coffee already poured, curtains half open, the neighborhood just beginning to stretch itself awake. No voices yet, no engines, no urgency. That morning, the air felt tight before the sound even landed. I remember thinking, who knocks like that so early? And before my mind could finish the question, the knock came again. Same rhythm, same confidence. I didn't rush. I never rush. I stood from my chair slowly, feeling the cool floor beneath my feet, already aware that whatever waited on the other side of that door wasn't ordinary. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful. My coffee sat untouched on the table. The clock ticked louder than usual. Even the trees outside seemed to hold still. When I reached the door, I paused with my hand on the handle, not from fear, but from instinct. Something was wrong. When I opened it, I saw the uniform first. Officer Miller stood on my porch, shoulders squared, posture stiff. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't relaxed. He held a large envelope against his chest with both hands, as if it weighed more than paper should. The sight of him unsettled me more than a stranger would have. I'd known Miller since he was a boy riding his bike down the street. He'd waved at me hundreds of times. He always greeted me like family. That morning, he wouldn't meet my eyes. Before he spoke, I knew. Not the details, not the reason, just the certainty that this moment had teeth. "Good morning, Mrs. Jefferson," he said, voice flat. He held out the envelope. No explanation yet, no preface, no kindness to soften it. The seal caught the light, official, clean, final looking. My fingers closed around the edge of it, but I didn't take it from him right away. I looked at his face instead. His jaw was tight, his breathing shallow. "Is something wrong, Miller?" I asked. He swallowed, then nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." That single word landed harder than any speech could have. As Miller adjusted his stance, my gaze slipped past him without thinking. Across the street, near the edge of my lawn, stood my son, Thatcher. He wasn't rushing over, he wasn't calling out, he wasn't surprised to see a police cruiser in my driveway. He was standing still, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like he already knew the ending. There was no concern on his face, no confusion, just patience, the kind people have when they're waiting for something they arranged themselves. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Before I could speak again, a sharp voice sliced through the quiet. "You should have packed when we told you to." Sloan. My daughter-in-law stood a few steps behind Thatcher, one hand on her hip, the other pointing in my direction. Her voice carried easily across the street, loud enough for windows to open. "We tried to make this easy for you. You never listen." The neighborhood was awake now. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open. I felt the weight of being watched, but I refused to shrink under it. Miller finally spoke again, slower this time. "Mrs. Jefferson, this is an eviction order." The word eviction doesn't belong in a place like this. Not in a house you paid for. Not in a life you built piece by piece. I didn't gasp. I didn't sway. I simply looked at the paper as if it might correct itself if I stared long enough. "Effective immediately," he continued. "You'll have 2 hours to gather essentials." 2 hours. To leave my home? To reduce decades into bags? If this scares you, subscribe now. Ignorance ruins families faster than greed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't give them the reaction they were waiting for. I looked at Thatcher again. He checked his watch. That told me everything. I turned back to Miller and finally took the envelope from his hands. It felt colder than paper should. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Miller," I said calmly, "who filed this?" He hesitated. That pause was small, almost polite, but I saw it. He flipped a page, then another. His brow creased, his mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The color drained from his face. He looked back at me, then over his shoulder towards Thatcher, then back at the paper like it had betrayed him. "Mrs. Jefferson," he whispered now, barely audible. His hands tightened around the document. "This doesn't make sense." I held his gaze, steady, because in that moment, I knew. Whatever they thought they'd buried, whatever they assumed I'd never notice, whatever they believed age had taken from me, it was about to surface. I moved into Oak Haven Estates 30 years ago. Back then, this street didn't look like it does now. The trees were thin. The sidewalks still smelled of fresh cement. People waved because they actually knew who lived behind each door. It was just Silas and me. We didn't arrive with moving trucks full of new furniture or plans to impress anyone. We arrived with boxes held together by tape, a borrowed pickup truck, and a promise to each other that this would be the last place we'd have to start over. This house wasn't handed down, it wasn't gifted, it wasn't luck. It was the result of staying late at work, of skipping trips, of choosing responsibility when it would have been easier not to. Every wall remembers that. People talk about homes like they're assets now. Square footage, market value, timing. To us, this place was proof that effort mattered. Silas worked construction. Long days, rough hands. He came home tired, but never bitter. I kept the books for a local firm. Numbers neat, balanced, exact. We didn't make a show of our life. We just built it slowly, like people who planned to stay. When we signed those papers, our hands shook, not from doubt, but from the weight of knowing we'd done something permanent. This house wasn't something we used, it was something we earned. Silas believed in finishing what you start. If something broke, he fixed it. If someone owed him, he waited. He never rushed outcomes because he trusted time to sort things properly. When he passed, this house became louder in its quiet. Every room carried his habits, the way he leaned his boots by the door, the way he insisted the porch lights stay on after dark, the crown molding we argued over for weeks because I wanted simple and he wanted something with character. We chose that molding together. They call that detail now. I call it memory. We didn't live extravagantly. We said no often. We planned carefully. We didn't borrow against tomorrow to decorate today. There were years we could have moved somewhere flashier, bigger, closer to status. We didn't, because we understood something a lot of people forget. Stability is built by staying. This house watched us age together, watched us disagree and forgive, watched us outgrow fears we once thought permanent. So when someone says, "You can always move," they don't understand what's being asked. To leave this place isn't relocation, it's removal. It's being told that the proof of your life is inconvenient, that the marks you left behind are obstacles, that the time you invested is now someone else's leverage. They didn't just want the house, they wanted the ground under my feet, the silence I earned, the history they didn't bother to learn. When Thatcher talks about efficiency, I hear dismissal. When Sloan talks about progress, I hear impatience. They don't see walls, they see numbers. People like me don't disappear easily. We don't rush, we don't shout, we don't beg for relevance. We build lives that last longer than trends. We invest in places that remember us. We stay long enough to know which floorboard creaks and which neighbor keeps their porch light on too late. This house knows me, and I know what it cost to keep. So when I stood on my porch that morning, eviction papers in hand, I didn't feel small. I felt something else. I felt the weight of 30 years being challenged by people who thought age meant weakness. They were wrong.
Thatcher didn't begin with demands. He began with questions. "How are you sleeping, Mom? Are the stairs giving you trouble? Have you thought about what happens if you fall?" They were framed as care, spoken softly, timed carefully, always delivered after a pause, as if he'd been worried but didn't want to burden me. At first, I answered honestly. I was sleeping fine. The stairs were stairs. Falling had never crossed my mind. He nodded each time, smiled, let the subject drop. But the questions returned, slightly altered, slightly closer together. Concern, when repeated often enough, starts to sound like diagnosis. Sloane's approach was different. She brought things. Tea I didn't drink, candles I didn't light, compliments that felt rehearsed. She'd sit across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, voice light. "We just worry about you," she'd say. "You've given so much. Don't you think it's time
Someone else took over the hard parts? She smiled when she said it, but the smile never reached her eyes. Her kindness always arrived with a suggestion attached. Not advice, not options, suggestions. And suggestions, repeated often enough, begin to feel like expectations. The pamphlets came next. Glossy, heavy paper. Photos of wide hallways and smiling staff. Words like comfort and support printed in calm fonts. She left them on my counter without asking. "I picked these up for you," she said once, "just in case." Just in case of what, she never said. I stacked them neatly and returned them to her bag the next time she visited. She laughed it off, but her jaw tightened. That told me more than her words ever did. After a while, my responses stopped influencing the conversation. I'd say I was fine. They'd respond as if I hadn't spoken. "You say that now," Thatcher would reply. "You've always been stubborn," Sloane added. Stubborn. It's a word people use when they don't like boundaries. They spoke about my life as if I were present but not participating. Plans formed without my consent. Conversations happened around me, not with me. I noticed they used my age often. Not directly, not cruelly, just enough to plant doubt. The house stopped being my home in their language. It became too much, outdated, a responsibility. Thatcher walked through rooms the way appraisers do. He pointed out repairs that weren't urgent, mentioned costs I hadn't asked about. "Property taxes are only going up," he said once, shaking his head. "I just don't want you overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. Another word that sounds helpful until it's used to justify decisions made for you. I didn't confront them. I listened. I noticed when concern turned into impatience, when advice became repetition, when kindness stopped accepting no as an answer. My instinct didn't shout warnings. It didn't demand action. It sat quietly and took notes. People underestimate that kind of awareness. They think danger announces itself loudly. They think control arrives with force. Sometimes it arrives with smiles and folded hands. The papers came on a Tuesday afternoon. Thatcher said they were tax-related, cleanup, old files Silas had left behind. He said he'd already spoken to someone who understood these things better than either of us. "You trust me, right?" he asked. I did. That's the part people avoid talking about. Trust doesn't feel reckless when it's earned over decades. I signed where he pointed. The process felt routine, familiar, almost boring. I didn't read every line. I didn't suspect anything. Because manipulation rarely asks for permission. It waits for comfort. Before I tell you what those papers really were, I need to ask you something. Have you ever trusted the wrong family member? Those papers didn't raise alarms that day. They didn't change my routine. They didn't alter how I slept or how I brewed my coffee the next morning. Life continued. That's what makes moments like these dangerous. They don't arrive as turning points. They arrive as errands. I put the memory aside, the way you do with things that don't seem important at the time. But they were important. I just didn't know how yet. Much later, standing on my porch with an officer in front of me and my son across the street,
I would think back to that afternoon, to the pen in my hand, to the trust in my chest, to the ease with which I signed, and I would realize something chilling in its simplicity. Those papers he brought me, I didn't know what they really were. Yet. Officer Miller cleared his throat before speaking again. He didn't rush. That alone told me how serious this was. "Mrs. Jefferson," he said, careful now, "this order was issued by the county court. It authorizes immediate removal." Removal. Not relocation, not transition, removal. The words stripped warmth from the morning. It made my porch feel smaller, like it had suddenly become public property. I held the envelope tighter, steadying myself, refusing to give it the satisfaction of a tremble. "And on what grounds?" I asked. Miller hesitated again. "That information is listed in the filing," he said, "along with the petitioner." He looked at the page, then back at me. "The eviction was filed by the current property holder," he continued. I waited. Thatcher Balagoon. The name sat between us, not shouted, not whispered, spoken like a fact. Across the street, my son didn't flinch. That was the moment the truth settled into my chest, not like pain, but like weight. Heavy, unavoidable. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was intention. By then, curtains had shifted. Doors cracked open. Mrs. Gable stood halfway onto her porch, robe tied loosely, eyes wide with curiosity she didn't bother to hide. 2 houses down, someone pretended to water plants while listening closely. Oak Haven Estates had always been quiet, respectful. That morning, it felt like a courtroom with no walls. No one stepped in. No one asked questions. They just watched. And I understood why. People don't interrupt moments like this. They document them quietly and carry the story later. Sloane didn't mind the audience. She took a few steps forward, heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her voice rising. "You gave you plenty of warning," she called out. "You chose not to listen." I turned my head slightly, acknowledging her without facing her fully. "You could have made this easy," she continued, "but you always have to do things your way." Her tone was practiced, confident, like she'd rehearsed this version of events long before the morning arrived. "This neighborhood is changing," she added, gesturing around her, "and you're just holding it back." Holding it back, as if a life spent building something solid was an inconvenience. She smiled while she spoke, not kindly, not nervously, pleased. The words weren't meant for me alone. They were meant for everyone watching, for the neighbors, for the street, for the story that would spread by evening. This wasn't just eviction. This was performance. They expected tears. They expected panic, a raised voice, a plea. They expected age to soften my spine. Instead, I stood still. I didn't correct Sloane. I didn't explain myself to the neighbors. I didn't ask my son why. Because asking why gives people room to lie, and I already knew the answer. Silence unsettles people who crave control. Sloane's smile tightened. Thatcher shifted his weight, checking his watch again. "Mom, let's not drag this out," he called out, finally speaking. Drag this out, as if decades could be wrapped up quickly if everyone cooperated. I looked at him directly then, not with anger, not with disbelief, with recognition. This wasn't the boy I raised. This was a man he convinced he'd already won. Officer Miller stood between us, posture stiff, eyes darting from me to them. He didn't like this, that was clear. But paperwork has its own authority. It doesn't ask how you feel about carrying it out. "Mrs. Balagoon," he said quietly, "I'll need you to start preparing." I nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. I looked past Miller again, meeting Thatcher's gaze across the street. Not a word passed between us. That silence did more than shouting ever could. People watching this story might think I'd given up. They were wrong. Public moments like this reveal more than private ones ever could. They show who rushes, who performs, who panics, and they show who waits. I waited, because restraint isn't weakness, it's selection, and I was choosing my next move carefully. Some people watching this story will say what my son did was practical. Others will say it was unforgivable. So let me ask you, was this justified or was it betrayal? As Sloane continued speaking, as neighbors watched, as my son stood certain of the outcome, none of them noticed what mattered most. They didn't notice Officer Miller reading the paperwork again, didn't notice his brow crease slightly, didn't notice him pausing longer than before. They were focused on the spectacle. I was focused on the details, because details decide who walks away whole. I folded the eviction papers once, neatly. I looked back at Miller and spoke evenly. "Miller," I said, "before I step inside, I have one question." He looked up. The street went quiet, and for the first time since that knock at 8 a.m., the balance of power began to change. When Miller paused on my porch, something old stirred in my mind. Not panic, recognition. My eyes dropped to the envelope in my hands, and suddenly I wasn't standing there anymore. I was months back, seated at my kitchen table, sunlight falling across paperwork I didn't ask for but didn't question. Thatcher sat across from me then, relaxed, confident, familiar. That's how trust enters a room, already comfortable. He told me it was administrative, cleanup, loose ends, old files Silas had left behind. He said nothing changes for you. He slid the stack closer. Protects. That word did its work quietly. I skimmed
Recognized legal language without alarm. I'd spent years around documents, numbers, signatures, forms that meant nothing until they meant everything. He pointed, I signed. No rush, no pressure, no warning. That's what made it easy. People like to believe betrayal comes with tension. Raised voices, cold silences, threats. But trust is soft, familiar. It doesn't announce itself. I trusted my son because he was my son. Because he'd sat at this same table as a child, swinging his legs, asking questions about numbers he didn't yet understand. Because I believed the person he once was would restrain the person he'd become. That belief cost me more than money ever could. Standing there on my porch, I understood something I hadn't before. Those documents didn't adjust ownership. They removed me. Quietly, cleanly, completely. The house didn't move. I did. On paper. Without argument, without noise. One signature. That's all it took. When Miller looked down again at the filing, his hesitation deepened. There's a corporate entity listed here, he said carefully, an LLC. The word settled like a weight. Limited, liability, company. Not a person, not a family, a structure. That's how he did it. Not directly, not openly, through layers. An LLC doesn't feel guilt. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't remember dinners or holidays or who fixed the porch rail when it broke. It exists to hold, shift, and protect interests. And Thatcher had placed my home inside it. Not as a place to live, as leverage. That realization didn't sting. It burned. I looked at Thatcher again across the street. The distance between us felt larger now, stretched thin by paperwork and intention. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't impatience. It was planning. Careful, deliberate, hidden behind concern. The son I raised didn't do this. The man he'd chosen to become did. No birds, no voices, no movement. Just the paper in my hands. Just my breathing. Just the sound of 30 years being rewritten without my consent. I signed. I trusted. He filed. He waited. He watched. People use gentle words for acts like this. Strategic, efficient, practical. I don't. When someone studies your habits, your age, your love, and uses all three against you, that isn't planning, that's predation. Losing a house hurts. Being removed from your own life hurts more. Because it isn't about walls, it's about being told you no longer belong in the space you built. Being told your value expired quietly while you were still standing in the room. They thought age had slowed me. They thought familiarity had softened me. They thought love meant blindness. They were wrong on all three. Because love doesn't erase awareness, it sharpens it. Anger didn't arrive loudly. It arrived clear, cold, focused. The kind that doesn't shout or rush. The kind that waits for proof and then acts. As I folded the papers again, I didn't feel defeated. I felt precise. Because once you understand how something was taken, you understand how to take control back. And they hadn't realized yet, signing those papers didn't end me. It revealed them. Officer Miller gave me space. Not much, just enough. He expected me to gather clothes, shoes, medication, the things people grab when they believe they're leaving for good. Sloane was already unloading boxes from her SUV, stacking them on the curb like props in a play she believed she was directing. "Take what you need, the rest can stay." I didn't respond, because I wasn't looking for what I needed to survive the day. I was looking for what I needed to finish it. I stepped back into my house slowly. The hallway smelled like old wood and coffee, familiar, steady, unchanged. I passed the bedroom, the closet, the dresser. Those things could wait. I didn't open a single drawer. I went straight to the den. Most people thought that room was decorative. Bookshelves, framed photos, a desk that looked more sentimental than useful. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. I sat down, opened the bottom drawer, and reached past the papers anyone could see. Behind them was a slim black ledger, unmarked, unassuming, unignored by me. Before I was anyone's mother, before I became a widow, before I was reduced to a concern, I kept records. For decades, I balanced accounts for companies that handled more money than most people see in a lifetime. I tracked expenses others tried to bury. I noticed patterns others missed. I wasn't flashy. I was accurate. That ledger wasn't nostalgia. It was habit. Silas believed in writing things down, not because he distrusted people, but because memory fades and paper doesn't. Every loan Thatcher ever asked for, every temporary favor, every repayment promised and delayed, I wrote it all down. Dates, amounts, explanations. Not out of suspicion, out of order. As I flipped through the pages, the pattern came into focus. Not mistakes, not bad luck. Movement. Money flowing out, money coming back from places it shouldn't. Company names that didn't match invoices. Transfers that avoided notice by staying just under limits. My home wasn't collateral by accident. It was chosen. I stopped turning the pages, sat back, listened to the quiet. Outside, Sloane's voice drifted through the open window, sharp and impatient. Thatcher paced. Miller waited. Inside, I understood the scale of what had been done, not just to me, but through me. This wasn't a family dispute. This wasn't greed alone. This was calculated use of proximity, of access, of trust. The kind that assumes silence, the kind that relies on being underestimated. That thought hurt more than the paperwork. I remembered Thatcher as a child, asking why numbers mattered, why rules existed, why shortcuts didn't last. Somewhere along the way, he stopped asking and started taking. I didn't pack clothes. I gathered evidence. I photographed pages, clear, steady.
enough to show patterns, not just totals. I noted dates that aligned too well with his recent lifestyle changes, trips, purchases, debts disguised as investments. This wasn't impulsive, it was sustained. Before I step back onto that porch, before I explain what I saw, before anything else happens, stay with me. This part matters. I placed the ledger back where it belonged, closed the drawer, stood. There was no rush in my body now, no confusion. Understanding does that. It replaces panic with direction. Outside, they still thought I was stalling. They thought time was on their side. They thought age meant delay. They were wrong. When I stepped toward the door again, my hands were empty. No boxes, no bags, but I carried something heavier than anything Sloane had stacked on the curb. I carried proof, and proof doesn't shout. It waits for the right moment to speak. When I stepped back onto the porch, Officer Miller straightened. He expected questions, arguments, delays. What he didn't expect was calm. "Before anything else happens," I said, "I need to make a phone call." Sloane scoffed loudly. "You've had enough time." I didn't look at her, because this wasn't about arguing procedure. It was about timing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. There are contacts you keep out of habit, numbers that stay saved long after you stop using them, not because you expect to call, but because history teaches you not to erase leverage. I scrolled once, then stopped. Colton Vaints answered on the second ring. No greeting, no surprise, just recognition. "I need to collect on a favor," I replied. Silence followed. Not confusion, not hesitation. Calculation. "How serious?" he asked. "Serious enough that I need you here and I need you to come yourself." Another pause. "Give me a reason." I looked across the street at my son, at his confidence, at his certainty. "I'm sending you photos," I said. "You'll understand." Years ago, Silas helped Colton through a situation that couldn't be solved with paperwork alone. No one ever spoke of it publicly. No one needed to. Some debts don't expire. They wait. Colton knew that. "Send them," he said. I didn't send everything, just enough. A few pages from the ledger, dates aligned, transfers clear. Patterns speak louder than totals. I watched the checkmark turn solid. Delivered. I put the phone back in my pocket.
No announcement. No explanation. Sloane folded her arms. "Is that it?" "That's it," I said. Thatcher laughed once, short, sharp. "You think calling someone changes this?" he asked. I didn't answer, because waiting had already begun. People misunderstand waiting. They think it's passive. It isn't. Waiting is how you let others reveal themselves, how impatience shows cracks, how confidence turns reckless. Sloane paced. Thatcher checked his watch again. Officer Miller shifted his stance, uneasy. I stayed still. Explaining invites interruption. It gives people a chance to adjust their story. I didn't need that. I needed them exactly as they were. Certain, exposed, careless. Officer Miller glanced at me, then at the street, then back at the eviction papers. Something had changed, though nothing visible had happened yet. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. "I'm waiting for confirmation." "Of what?" "That the paperwork in your hand deserves a second look." Minutes passed. They felt longer for them than for me. Sloane muttered about locksmith schedules. Thatcher made a call of his own, turning his back slightly as if privacy might restore control. It didn't, because some forces don't rush. They arrive when the moment is ready. I heard it before anyone else did. Not sirens, engines. Slow, deliberate, approaching. Thatcher heard it next. His head turned, his posture shifted. Sloane stopped pacing. Officer Miller looked toward the street. I didn't need to. Everything I needed to say had already been delivered. Not through argument, through records, through timing, through someone who knew exactly what those records meant. Waiting gave me space. Waiting gave me clarity. Waiting let them believe they were still in control long enough to make the next part unavoidable. As the sound drew closer, I finally spoke again. "Thatcher," I said calmly, "you should stay right where you are." He frowned. "Why?" I didn't answer, because explanations come after authority arrives. They believed this was a family matter. They believed this would end with embarrassment at worst. They believed age had limited my reach. They were wrong, and the proof was about to turn onto Oak Lane. Thatcher began pacing, short steps at first, measured, controlled, the kind of movement people make when they believe they're waiting out a formality. He walked from the edge of the driveway to the sidewalk and back again with his phone in hand, thumb tapping the screen as if time itself might respond. He checked his watch. Then again. Confidence has a rhythm when it's real. When it's not, it starts to stutter. Sloane didn't pace. She prowled. Every few seconds, she looked toward the end of the street, then back at Officer Miller, then at me. This is ridiculous. She's wasting everyone's time. Her voice was sharp now, stripped of its earlier polish. "We've been more than patient," she added, loud enough for the neighbors still watching from behind glass. At some point, this becomes refusal. Refusal, a word meant to justify force. The sound reached us before the vehicle did, metal rattling in the back of a van, tools shifting. The locksmith pulled to a stop just short of the driveway, engine idling. He stepped out, glanced at the house, then at the group gathered in front of it. "Who called?" Sloane raised her hand immediately. "We did." She walked toward him like this was already settled. Officer Miller stepped forward. "Hold on," he said. "This hasn't been completed yet." Sloane turned on him fast. "You said she had 2 hours. That time is nearly up." She pointed at me. "She hasn't packed a thing." Miller glanced at his watch. So did Thatcher. They were counting minutes. I was counting reactions. They expected movement, a bag, a box, something to signal surrender. Instead, I stood exactly where I'd been standing, hands folded, posture straight, eyes clear. People mistake stillness for confusion. It isn't. Stillness is decision without display. "Enough," Sloane snapped. "Miller, do your job." The locksmith shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered. Sloane ignored him. "The order is signed. The house is ours." Ours. That word carried entitlement like it was born with it. Thatcher stepped forward now, voice calm but tight. "Mom," he said, "we don't have to make us ugly." Ugly, as if ugliness were something he'd stumbled into by accident. "This is business," he continued. "You're holding things up." I met his eyes. "No," I said. "I'm allowing things to catch up." No one spoke for a moment. The locksmith glanced at Miller again. Miller didn't move. Sloane clenched her jaw. Thatcher looked toward the street one more time. Nothing had arrived yet. That made him bold. "Let's proceed," Sloane said, louder now. "She's had her chance." She turned to the locksmith. "Go ahead." The man hesitated. "I need confirmation." Sloane scoffed. "From who?" He looked at Miller. Miller looked at me. I could have spoken then. I could have explained what I'd found, what I knew, what was coming. I didn't. Because people reveal more when they think they're winning. Thatcher checked his phone again. His earlier confidence had thinned. His steps slowed. His shoulders tightened. Time does that. It exposes what certainty tries to hide. "This is elder stubbornness," she snapped, gesturing at me. "She doesn't understand what's happening." I felt the neighbors stiffen at that. She'd said it too plainly. Control hates patience. It always slips eventually. "Ma'am," Miller said to Sloane, "lower your voice." She rounded on him. "Are you taking her side now?" "I'm taking procedure seriously," he replied. That word landed differently now.
procedure, because procedure is where stories get checked. I stepped forward 1 pace, not toward them, toward Miller. "This won't take much longer," I said. "I promise." Thatcher frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I replied evenly, "you should stop rushing what you don't fully understand." The street went quiet again. Even Sloane stopped talking. Then the sound returned. Engines. Closer now. Slower than before. Deliberate. Thatcher's posture changed. He stopped pacing. Sloane turned, eyes narrowing. The locksmith stepped back instinctively. They had been counting minutes. I had been counting consequences. And those consequences were finally pulling onto Oak Lane. The engine noise reached us first. Low, steady, unhurried. Not the sound of someone rushing to catch up, but of someone arriving exactly when they intended to. The black sedan turned onto Oak Lane and rolled forward without urgency. Its paint reflected the morning light without shine or display. No markings, no announcement. It stopped directly behind the police cruiser, blocking the driveway, blocking Thatcher's SUV. That detail mattered. No one spoke. Sloane's mouth stayed open a second too long before she closed it. The locksmith stepped back without being told. Officer Miller straightened fully, his attention shifting instantly. Thatcher stared at the car. Not curious. Alert. The kind of alert when confidence realizes it may have misjudged the room. The sedan's doors opened slowly. 2 men stepped out. Dark suits, no rush, no performance. One carried a briefcase, the other scanned the street briefly, taking in faces, vehicles, exits. They didn't look at me first. They looked at the paperwork in Miller's hand. That alone told me everything I needed to know. One of the men stepped forward. "Thatcher Jefferson," he called. Not loud, clear. Thatcher hesitated, then lifted his chin. "Yes? Who's asking?" The man held his badge at chest level long enough for everyone to see it clearly. Colton Wance, State Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. The street seemed to shrink around those words. Thatcher laughed once, forced, sharp. "This is a civil matter," he said quickly. "You're not supposed to be here." Colton didn't respond to that. He turned to Officer Miller instead. "We're requesting an immediate hold on the eviction order. This property is now connected to an active investigation." Miller blinked once, then nodded. "Yes, sir." That was the sound of momentum changing direction. "You can't just stop this," Sloane snapped, stepping forward. "That house belongs to our company." Colton finally looked at Sloane. A brief look, assessing, final. "Ma'am," he said, "that's exactly the issue." She faltered, just slightly. Colton placed the briefcase on the hood of the sedan and opened it. Inside were documents, neatly stacked, labeled, prepared. He removed a folder and handed it to Miller. "These filings show the transfer of this property into an LLC 6 months ago. That transfer is now under review due to irregularities in funding sources and reporting." Miller scanned the pages. His expression hardened. "So," Colton continued calmly, "until this review is complete, no eviction can proceed." Sloane shook her head. "This is harassment."
Colton didn't look at her. "Sir," Miller said to me, then corrected himself, "Ma'am, this eviction is suspended." Suspended. The word landed clean. Final. Colton turned his attention back to Thatcher. "Golden Sunset Holdings," he said. "You're listed as CEO." "Yes," Thatcher replied. "That's my company." "Your company," Colton said evenly, "has been used to move funds through accounts tied to undeclared liabilities." Sloane's head snapped toward Thatcher. "What is he talking about?" Thatcher didn't answer. Colton didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He stated, "Loans taken against assets not lawfully acquired. Transfers structured to avoid reporting thresholds. Use of family property to establish legitimacy. Each phrase was delivered without pause. Facts don't need emphasis. The neighbors who'd been watching quietly stepped back. Curtains closed, doors shut. No one wanted to be part of what this had become. The locksmith left without saying a word. "This is ridiculous," Thatcher said. "My mother doesn't understand any of this." Colton turned to me. "Mrs. Balagan," he asked, "did you authorize the transfer of your home into this company?" I met his eyes. "No," I said. Clear, simple. "No." Colton nodded once. "That answers that." He turned back to Thatcher. "We've been monitoring these accounts for several months. We were waiting for confirmation of intent." "Intent for what?" Thatcher snapped. "To liquidate," Colton replied, "which you attempted today." "Fraud," Colton said, not loudly, not angrily, like a diagnosis. Sloane stepped back as if struck. "That's not possible," she said. "He wouldn't." Colton closed the folder. "It already happened," he replied. Officer Miller folded the eviction order slowly, then tore it in half. He didn't look at Thatcher when he did it. He handed the pieces to Colton. "Eviction stayed, pending investigation." I exhaled for the first time since morning. Colton gestured to his partner. "We'll need to speak with you privately," he told Thatcher. Thatcher looked around, at Sloane, at the house, at me. For the first time that day, he didn't know what came next. Justice doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It arrives prepared. That black sedan didn't bring noise. It brought clarity, and with it, everything they thought they controlled began to fall apart. Colton didn't accuse. He explained. That difference mattered. He spoke the way people do when the outcome is already decided and the only thing left is clarity. "Golden Sunset Holdings," he said, addressing Thatcher, "wasn't created to manage property. It was created to move money." Sloane laughed weakly. "That's not true." Colton didn't look at her. "The transfers started 2 years ago. Small amounts, regular intervals, always routed through accounts connected to recreational facilities." Thatcher shifted his weight. "What facilities?" Sloane asked. Colton flipped a page. "Riverboat casinos," he said, 3 counties over. The word hung there. Casinos. Sloane turned sharply toward her husband. "You told me those trips were business. You said investors wanted face-to-face meetings." Thatcher didn't respond. His silence was louder than any confession. Colton glanced at me briefly before continuing. "Your mother provided records," he said. "Independent, detailed, consistent." He tapped the folder. "They match bank activity exactly." I felt the weight of that moment settle in. Not pride, confirmation. The gambling losses escalated. Early wins gave way to debt. Debt led to borrowing. Borrowing led to concealment. He paused. And concealment led to theft. Sloane shook her head slowly. "You said you were expanding. You said the money was temporary." Thatcher swallowed hard. Business partners believed funds were being reinvested. In reality, those funds were redirected to cover personal losses. Embezzlement doesn't announce itself with a single action. It builds quietly, layer by layer. "The property provided legitimacy," he said, "an owned asset, clean title, stable history." He looked at me again. "Until it was transferred. That's when it became useful, not as a home, as cover." Sloane took a step back, then another. "No, that's not possible," she said faintly. "We just remodeled. The furniture." She stopped herself. The realization arrived, not at once, piece by piece. "You used my accounts, didn't you?" Thatcher's shoulders sagged.
"I was going to fix it," he said suddenly, his voice cracked. "I just needed one big win." No one responded. Excuses sound smaller when spoken out loud. "I was going to put everything back," he continued. "The house, the money, everything." I stepped forward then, not to confront, to conclude. "You planned not to fix anything," I said quietly. "You planned to finish." Thatcher looked at me. For the first time, his certainty was gone. "You planned to remove me," I continued, "because I was the last thing standing between you and exposure." His mouth opened. No words came. Sloane looked at him like she was seeing a stranger. "All this time," she whispered, "you let me defend you." Colton closed the folder. "This investigation includes multiple charges: financial crimes, fraud, misrepresentation." He turned to Thatcher. "You'll need to come with us." Thatcher flinched when the metal touched his wrists, not because it hurt, because it was final. Sloane let out a sound that wasn't quite a cry. "What happens now?" she asked. Colton answered without softness. "Assets are frozen, accounts reviewed, statements taken." He paused. "And this house returns to its original owner." No one cheered. No one spoke. The neighbors stayed inside. Justice doesn't invite applause. It leaves silence. As they led my son away, I stood still, watching, thinking. And now I ask you, was this justice or revenge? Thatcher's confidence didn't fade slowly. It vanished. Years of control, careful positioning, calculated silence, all of it gone in minutes, because truth doesn't negotiate. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity, and clarity is heavier than anger. The house stood behind me, unmoved, unchanged, waiting, just like it always had. The metal clicked once, then again. That sound carried farther than shouting ever could. Thatcher stiffened as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, not violently, not roughly, firm, practiced, certain. No one rushed him, no one needed to. The moment had already passed. No one clapped, no one spoke. The neighbors who had lingered earlier stayed hidden now, watching through glass but unwilling to witness the end directly. Public downfall doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with avoidance. People retreat when consequences stop being theoretical. As Colton guided Thatcher toward the sedan, my son didn't turn around. Not toward me, not toward the house he once believed he controlled. His shoulders sagged, his steps slowed. Control had been replaced by gravity. Sloane stood frozen near the curb. Her earlier sharpness was gone. Her posture collapsed inward as if she were shrinking to avoid being noticed. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply stared at the ground, as if answers might appear there. They didn't. Officer Miller remained near the porch. He didn't approach Thatcher. His attention stayed with me. When the sedan doors closed, he exhaled quietly, then turned. "I'm sorry you went through this," he said. His voice carried something different now, not procedure, respect. "I should have looked closer sooner," he added. "You did your job," I replied. "No," he said, "I followed paper." That distinction mattered. He nodded once, as if committing it to memory. The sedan pulled away slowly. No sirens, no urgency, just finality. The sound faded, leaving Oak Lane the way it had been earlier that morning. Quiet, orderly, pretending nothing had happened. But everything had. The handcuffs weren't punishment. They were punctuation. They marked the end of a story Thatcher believed he controlled. They also marked the beginning of another, one he couldn't manage from a distance.
I didn't call out to him. I didn't demand explanation or apology. Some words arrive too late to matter, and some moments don't require speech to be complete. Miller tore the remaining eviction paperwork cleanly and dropped it into his folder. "This matter is closed on our end," he said. He handed me a small card. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call." I nodded. Not because I needed help, because he offered it correctly. I turned and looked at my home. Same porch, same door, same threshold. It hadn't changed, only the threat had. People talk about justice like it needs decoration. It doesn't. It needs accuracy, timing, follow-through. That morning had delivered all three. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt settled, like something out of alignment had finally been corrected. Before leaving, Miller paused. "You handled that with more restraint than most," he said. I met his eyes. "Restraint isn't passive, it's deliberate." He nodded again, and then he was gone. The street was empty now. No boxes, no locksmith, no raised voices. Just space. And space, once reclaimed, has a way of reminding you what belongs where. When the last vehicle disappeared from Oak Lane, the silence didn't rush back in. It arrived slowly, like the neighborhood itself needed time to decide whether it was safe to breathe again. I stood on my porch for a few moments longer, listening to the absence of sound. No engines, no raised voices, no authority filling the street. Just stillness, different from the quiet earlier that morning, lighter. I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. The click of the lock sounded final in a way it hadn't before. Nothing inside had moved, nothing had been taken, nothing needed to be reclaimed physically, but something had shifted back into alignment. Ownership isn't always about paperwork. Sometimes it's about who remains when others are removed. I set the eviction envelope on the kitchen counter, then pushed it aside. It no longer deserved my attention. By early afternoon, the phone rang. It wasn't Thatcher, it wasn't Sloan, it was confirmation. The transfer of the house had been flagged as invalid. The LLC was under review. The title reverted to what it had always been before interference complicated it. Mine. Not because of sentiment, because facts held. I thanked the voice on the other end and hung up. That was enough. Sloan didn't return. She didn't knock, she didn't call, she didn't leave a message asking what would happen next. By evening, her car was gone from the street. Later, I learned she'd taken a taxi earlier in the day, left with